Welcome everyone. So my name is Yasmina Kadir. I'm a recent PhD graduate in American Studies, and I'm an IASA Emerging Scholar Fellow and current also membership chair of the Organization of Emerging Scholars of the Southern Society for the Study of Southern Literature, and that's where I met Tori. And I would like to welcome everyone. I would like to thank also my colleagues in the Emerging Scholars Forum for organizing and for helping in the organization of this event. This is a lecture which comes as part of this series of webinars that we are trying to organize as emerging scholars. And I would like to especially thank our guest speaker today, Dr. Tori Bush, for accepting to be our speaker today and to share with us her work and findings. I would like to introduce her a bit, and then maybe she could add more later, like talk more about her research project and her work. So Dr. Tori Bush is is a visiting scholar at the New School and the Mellon Foundation postdoctoral fellow in climate humanities and social justice at the Climate Museum in New York. Her research and pedagogy broadly asks participants to interrogate how language about the natural world can act as a site of lingering settler colonial power structures that continue to hinder climate action today. She lives in New Orleans, Louisiana, with her husband and two dogs. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tori Bush. And we're so excited to hear your talk today.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, everybody.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so honored to be here to share some of my work. I especially want to thank Dr. Yasmina Kadir for inviting me and for moderating this discussion. So this is the first time that I'm going to be presenting part of this material, so I will really thank you for your patience. I'm going to try to speak for about 30 minutes, and that'll leave plenty of room for us to have a discussion afterwards. So as Dr. Kadir said, my name is Tori Bush. I'm from New Orleans, Louisiana. Usually I'm teaching environmental literature, but this year I'm the Mellon postdoc at the Climate Museum in New York and a visiting scholar at the New School. So I'm really excited to have this discussion with you about this work, but also your own afterwards as well. Today, I'm going to talk to you about part of a chapter from a book that I'm working on that thinks about how environmental literature has rhetorically described a small indigenous community of Ile-de-Jean-Charles. An assumption that underlies all of my thinking is that the language we use is both shaped by and shapes the environmental web of relations in which we exist. How we describe a fish, a bay, a river matters deeply. For example, when we call a plant a weed, we shape our relationship to it. When we call something a resource, it becomes a thing to be used. I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation as well. Okay, can everybody see this? Okay. So especially right now, when the language of how we are even naming the Gulf of Mexico is incredibly contested, it's clear to me that more than 4 centuries of extractive relationships and rhetoric has made communities on the front lines of climate more precarious. And I've included here a couple images and memes of how people are sort of renaming the Gulf right now. So I'm going to start where many others have begun, with the road. Island Road to Ile-de-Jean-Charles is not exactly a road, but more than the earth dug out from somewhere else and built up against the water in a futile attempt to offer easy access to the oil and gas pipelines crisscrossing the area. Constructed in the mid-20th century, when oil expansion was booming throughout the coast of Louisiana and Texas, the road provided not only the infrastructure to put in new pipelines, but also a bridge between Ile-de-Jean-Charles and the Chiligan-shaped coastline. The road is a good metaphor, perhaps too good, for the spatial and discursive distance of the island from the mainland of the United States, and the separation between the precarity of the island and the nation's protections, real or imagined, against climate change. The long paved strip of road surrounded by water on each side has proved to be a symbol that writers, photographers, journalists, and filmmakers have been unable to resist. For example, in the Ile de Jean Charles chapter of Elizabeth Colbert's new book, Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future, she begins, "The island can be reached by a single narrow causeway, which used to ride over land. Time it right, and you can now fish from your car." In her Pulitzer-nominated book, Rising, Dispatches from the New American Shore, Elizabeth Rush opens a chapter by writing, "Sometime during my first week in the Louisiana Bayou, I walked to Ile de Jean Charles. The island road, built in the early 50s after the oil rig went in, runs 8 miles southwest of Pointe aux Chenes, out between two expanses of water that neither has a name yet." In the first article from the New York Times that reported on the federal grant to relocate the community inland, Coral Davenport and Robert Campbell write, "Each morning at 3:30, when Joanne Berg leaves the mildewed and rusted house that her parents built, she worries that the bridge connecting the spit of waterlogged land to Louisiana's terra firma will be flooded and she will miss another day's work." And finally, in the film Beasts of the Southern Wild, which was filmed on Ile de Jean Charles, one of the opening scenes shows the fictional island community of the Bathtub walking down this road in celebration. So over and over again, the road has been sort of like the opening trope of this place, and is one of the many settler colonial representations found in contemporary writing and film about climate change in the Gulf that introduces audiences to this specific place, an island far from, yet connected to the mainland. Narrative representations have power. They create a discourse around a place, an amalgamation of trope, cliche, fact, and fiction, which shapes how people speak or think about a place. Island Road, one such representation, has created discourse of place that acts symbolically, suggesting the island community is separated culturally, racially, and historically from the nation. One of the challenges for environmental writers now is accurately describing a relatively new framework, that humans are unequivocally causing global warming, while the languages we've inherited to describe people and places are often derived from older literary forms and conventions. The narrative language and representations of the island are part of the deeper ideological structures found within the genre of popular environmental writing on climate change and global warming. This latent representation, a deeply embedded and almost unconscious kind of representation, is also rooted in centuries-old colonial tropes, which mark marshy coastal islands in the Gulf Coast as swampy, unusable land occupied only by those outside of settler society, such as indigenous communities and maroon groups. Anthony Wilson writes in Shadow and Shelter that the swamp is typically defined as an area outside of civilization, whose geographic features, notably its treacherous mix of water and earth, render it resistant to colonization of agriculture. The road is a modern symbol of a centuries-old representation, its murky roots found in the Euro-American settlers of previous centuries, yet still lingering on today. So in the book project that I'm working on, which is called Genre Flows, Settler Colonial Rhetorics and Environmental Writing, I try to map the long history of the genre of environmental writing in the Gulf South, to unpack how the language around the climate crisis can hold within it settler power dynamics. I use the term settler rhetoric to mean the language and narrative devices that make possible the separation of climate change from its that make possible the separation of climate change from its foundations of coloniality, indigenous land dispossession, and racial capitalism. Settler rhetoric makes neutral and normal the conditions of those most vulnerable to the climate crisis. I follow Mark Rifkin's thinking here, that's about settler common sense, about how to investigate cultural systems that can be understood as normalizing settler presence, privilege, and power. And just to orient us around sort of how I define settler colonialism, I want to include this quote from the article "Decolonization is Not a Metaphor," a canonical article. So like Tuck and Yang and Wolf here, who they're quoting, I also define settler colonialism as a structure, one that requires repeatable patterns of representation, And they say, within settler colonialism, the most important concern is land, water, air, subterranean earth. Land is what is most valuable, contested, required. This is why Patrick Wolfe emphasizes that settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. So the dominant global narratives and rhetoric of climate change are really quickly being formed. While humans have been aware of greenhouse gases' impact on the planet since about the 1850s, thanks to Eunice Foote, it's been only in the last 30 years or so that the contemporary language of climate change has become widely used and applied throughout the world. As Stacey Alamo writes in Exposed, Environmental Politics and Pleasure in Post-Human Times, popular science writing, whether it appears in books, magazines, websites, or social media, is one of the most crucial genres for environmentalism, yet it remains relatively neglected within the environmental humanities. Attention to the ambivalence within environmental writing, how to address planetary change with attention to the unequal distribution of who is impacted, is part of the work that environmental justice asks of us today. So before I continue, I sort of want to step back and talk a little bit about where I'm talking about. So let's talk a little bit about Ile de Jean Charles. I've included a map here, which is around the Gulf of Mexico. And if we move even closer, so you can see Louisiana here is marked by the Deepwater Horizon oil rig. If we move even closer in, we can see Ile de Jean Charles right nestled within the coastline. So nestled in the curve of the coastline, Ile de Jean Charles is a predominantly indigenous community made up of the John Charles Choctaw Nation, which is recognized by the state of Louisiana, but not the federal government. And they are navigating their future along this coast. This community was founded in part because of the original indigenous lands of the Chitimacha, Choctaw, and other Louisiana tribes were violently claimed by European and American settlers from the 16th century on. Indigenous communities escaped the 1830 removal acts towards the swampy coastline, land which before the era of oil and gas was deemed unusable for plantation agriculture. The island once encompassed more than 22,000 acres, but today less than 320 acres of the island remain. In 2016, under President Obama, they received one of the first federal grants to relocate away from the coast. Across newspapers, magazines, and media, they were dubbed the first U.S. climate refugees, a title that reveals a lot about power and how Indigenous communities are made part of and not part of the nation. So I want to talk a little bit about why this sort of like ontological disaster is happening to this land. So there's three main reasons for coastal land loss in these massive wetlands of the Gulf Coast. Levees, oil and gas pipelines, and sea rise from climate change are the three main reasons why there's so much land loss right now. The standard measurement that many Louisianans will tell you is that we lose a football field of land every single hour. So the Mississippi River is a land building machine. It drags sediment from a third of the continental US to the floodplains of the Mississippi Delta. The river has been building what's called the bird foot of Louisiana for over 7,000 years. So you'll see here a real zoom in of, this is a NASA image from 2018 of what's called the bird's foot of Louisiana, which is where the river dumps out into the Gulf of Mexico. So it brings sediment down and builds land as it disperses it. But when the first levee was built in 1719, just 1 year after the founding of New Orleans, and by the 1730s, enslaved labor had built over 50 miles of levees around the river. This started to shackle the river, keep it from moving, and then thus gathering sediment. In 1927, there was a massive flood. Flooding spread from Illinois to Louisiana with over 27,000 square miles underwater. In some places, the river submerged towns 30 feet high. From this, Congress passed the Flood Control Act of 1928, which ordered the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to prevent such flooding from ever happening again. By the mid-1930s, the Corps had put the river in what they call a straitjacket of levees. This effectively made it so that the sediment, which dragged down from the other parts of the continental United States and Canada, started shooting straight out into the Gulf and didn't act as a land builder. It just dumped out into the far ocean. So with this lack of new sediment, the land along the coast is subsiding or sinking lower. That's because the sheer weight of moist soil is always pushing down against the bedrock below. Like a sponge pressed out against the countertop, the soil compresses as the moisture is squeezed out. So another major reason why land loss is so significant here is the oil and gas pipelines and channels that have been built over the last century or so. The first oil well in the Louisiana coast was the Haywood No. 1, built in 1901. Oh, and I wanted to include this image. This is what a levee looks like along the Mississippi River. So here is a map of some of the oil and gas industry along the Louisiana coast. By the 1930s, eventually 7,000 wells oil and gas wells had been dug along the Gulf. So oil and gas companies, free to choose the cheapest and most direct ways to reach drilling sites, had oil companies dredge canals off natural waterways to transport rigs and work crews. The canals averaged 13 to 16 feet deep and 140 to 150 feet wide, far larger than the natural twisting waterways and bayous that happen in the swamp. More than 10,000 miles of canals were dredged to service pipelines. And these canals allowed salt water from the Gulf into the heart of the freshwater marshes and swamps, which killed plants and trees whose roots held the soils together. The annual supply of just plant detritus, one of the ways a delta disconnected from its river can maintain its elevation, began to be seriously reduced. And then the third reason is sea rise and storm surge. So sea rise is not equal across all coasts in the world. The NOAA predicts sea rise for the Gulf Coast will be as much as 14 to 18 inches in the next 30 years. And one of the ways I think that's really to visualize this is I have this very quick video which shows what the land loss actually looks like. Please tell me if for some reason you're not able to see this. And I think this video is useful for seeing how drastic the decimation of the coastline is. So knowing the physical systems that have led to the decimation of the coastline helps us deconstruct how settler ontologies about control over the environment have led to the erasure of the very material existence of Ile-de-Jean-Charles. Let's see if I can go to my next slide. There we go. Narratives about control over nature have been integral to the creation and maintenance of these public water and land policies. I argue that environmental writers, oftentimes with the best intentions, while writing about climate in the Gulf South, continue to use these settler rhetorics to control that make possible the separation of climate change from its foundations of indigenous land dispossession. I want to talk about a few examples of this. So in John McPhee's 1989 Control of Nature, John McPhee was a nonfiction writer for The New Yorker, sort of famously so. And in this book, Control of Nature, he explores a number of ways in which the United States has tried to control the natural world. Most relevant to our discussion, he explores the old river lock of the Mississippi River, and how through levee systems, the Army Corps of Engineers, as they themselves said, harnessed it, straightened it, and shackled it. The Mississippi River naturally meanders, meaning it changes its course over time as a way to deliver sediment to the Gulf. But as McPhee notes in the chapter, quote, "For the Mississippi to make such a change was completely natural, but in the interval since the last shift, Europeans had settled besides the river. A nation had developed, and the nation could not afford nature." In a video from the Army Corps of Engineers, they said, "This nation has a large and powerful adversary. Our opponent could cause the United States to lose nearly all her seaborne commerce, to lose her standing as first among trading nations. We are fighting Mother Earth, or Mother Nature. It's a battle we have to fight day by day, year by year. The health of our economy depends on this victory." McPhee underscores here that U.S. attempts to control nature are inherently militaristic and part of a nation-building strategy. McPhee's tone does make it seem all very ridiculous, but this ridiculousness is the hubris of humans rather than the violent U.S. system that doubly displaces the coast. Once with the first land disposition, especially of the 1830 Land Acts, and again now by cutting off the river. As Gina Kaysen writes in Erosion, the preservation of lands works alongside the preservation of settler colonial nation as an entity. McPhee does not critique the logic that the U.S. has the right to control the river, despite the cost downstream. In fact, in 1989, there's not even recognition from McPhee that the shackling of the river is starving the wetlands of needed sediment. Control narratives are often also about erasure. While McPhee's 1989 text in many ways precedes larger conversations in the environmental humanities about the folly and failure of human domination of complex ecologies, these critiques still presume settler rights. Like much U.S. environmental history, environmentalists have historically overlooked the complex interplay between environmental values and indigenous, Black, or other racially, ethnically, and economically marginalized communities' rights to land relations. Not once in McPhee's writing about the Mississippi does he consider the complex settler history of the Gulf, which pushed non-white settlers into the furthest reaches of the coastline. Like Tim Choi in Ecologies of Comparison, McPhee's language reveals how knowledge practices determine environmental politics, and how some writers confronting the climate are utilizing knowledge practices that put them in conflict with the communities on the front lines of the climate crisis. In this way, McPhee, a canonical writer of nonfiction, explores the dubious nature of control without questioning who claims to have control over lands and whether or not that control is based in historical violence over people as well. In 2021, another New Yorker writer, Elizabeth Colbert, author of The Sixth Extinction, wrote a sort of updated account of McPhee's book. In Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future, Colbert considers how some of the major responses to climate change have been yet another form of control, or as she writes, a control of the control. She also returns to the Mississippi River and, like McPhee, asks, how has the control of nature revealed geographical hierarchies apparent in the nation-building project? She writes, since the 1930s, Louisiana has shrunk by more than 2,000 square miles. If Delaware or Rhode Island had lost that much territory, America would have only 49 states. This striking statement emphasizes how control inherently makes hierarchies of place. Some places are worth saving while others are not. If 2,000 square miles, Colbert seems to say, disappeared off Washington's doorstep, what would be the reaction? Colbert, unlike McPhee, visits indigenous coastal communities like Ile de Jean Charles. Also unlike McPhee, her writing makes very apparent the long-term effects of human control over the environment, like the disappearance of a large chunk of the U.S. coastline. Colbert's writing and rhetoric clarify tensions between the control of the river and the community's right to exist on the land. However, Colbert also still falls into settler rhetoric stereotypes when she describes the island as culturally and economically outside the bounds of the nation. In an interview with Ile-de-Jean-Charles resident Boyo Bilio, Colbert writes about the founder of Ile-de-Jean-Charles and about how his family married through generations the Chitimacha, Choctaw, Biloxi, and Homa peoples. She writes, most of their children remained on the island, where they formed their own tightly knit, largely self-sufficient community. She sort of describes this foundational narrative of the island as self-sufficient community far from the mainland. And Bilio confirms this trope. He says, they went for years and years, and nobody knew there was anybody living here. They had the Great Depression. They didn't know anything about it over there because it didn't affect them. Bilio, as a member of the island community, uses a third person pronoun, they, to describe his own community as one they, and the national community as another they. He sort of grammatically separates his community from the they of the nation. It marks an ambivalence within the text that even Bilio is separating himself from the nation. Colbert continues on describing the island as remote. She writes, the Ile-de-Jean-Charles band has been able to live peacefully on the island because it was too isolated and commercially irrelevant for anyone to take interest in. The band had no say in dredging the oil canals or in the layout of the Morganza to the Gulf Project. They'd been excluded from the efforts to control the Mississippi, and now that new forms of control were being imposed to counter the effects of the old, they were being excluded from those too. Colbert suggests that the isolation of the island and the lack of economic integration left the community unable to control what had been their ancestral land. However, this is far from the truth. The island itself is far from separated from the national economy. In fact, Ile-de-Jean-Charles exists as part of the network of oil and gas pipelines and refinery facilities that account for almost 30% of total national gas production in the United States. It is, in fact, central to the nation's energy economy. While describing the community as isolated seems at first to be morally neutral and objectively valid, it is in fact makes a community on the front lines even more precarious. It also suggests that this loss of place will have little impact on the nation as a whole, while in fact the sacrifice of this coastline is a requirement for U.S. energy economies. I will sort of finish here soon just by saying that the control of nature has long been explicitly tied to the project of conquest in settler colonial cultures, but also fundamentally interlinked into the ideologies of imperialism and racism on which those projects rely. Ile-de-Jean-Charles, as part of the United States, is a space that is both colonized and colonizer. It's a geographical space which is both an indigenous site of resistance from white settler colonialism, but is also a site that is part of the American Empire. It's both inside and outside, politically separate, yet ecologically entwined in the nation. It is a space because of its plurality of states, provides a new vantage point from which to, or a unique vantage point from which to look into the future of climate change's rising seas. So I'm going to wrap up there. Thank you so much for listening. I'm really happy to answer any questions about this project and happy to talk a little bit about your own work as well. Stop my presentation as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tori, for this wonderful presentation. And you can see the reactions. Everyone is really appreciating the presentation. And I hope we will have some questions and ideas for discussion. So I would like to open the floor maybe for the audience, if they do have any questions for the speaker.
I'm also just wanted to say happy to add any clarifications about if there's any, like organizations, like I mentioned the Army Corps of Engineers, it's sort of a specific thing. So I'm happy to clarify anything if anybody has questions.
Yeah, and please feel free either to raise your hand, to speak to the mic, or just to write your question or your comment on the chat box. So Yeah, George. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I want to pick up on that, Dr. Bush. The Army Corps of Engineers. It seems that in your research, as well as in the little that I know about that history, they seem to be one of the major forces really shaping and carving the land and really like doing all kinds of things that are very sort of destructive for a number of communities. Can you tell us a little bit about, so how did they come into being, and what is this sort of, is this really overall a general perception of them, or is it is this a perception by those communities who were most affected, or was this perception at one point or another different? I'm thinking, for example, and this is not just about the Army Corps of Engineers, but I suspect that in the during the New Deal, some of the public works programs and the dam building and all of that stuff is, it's going to help us out of our depression and all that, and growth and economy and all that. So some of that is sort of complicates the history, or maybe the deeper history of your research. Thank you.
Yeah. That is such a, thank you so much for that question. It's a really complicated one to answer, because I think, especially around like land and water rights, there's always going to be distinct perceptions of what is legally and ethically correct. So the Army Corps of Engineers is a really weird and interesting organization within the United States history. It is in part a military organization. It's also in part run by engineers and scientists. And so I think it's an organization that, being where I'm from in New Orleans, a city where the levees sort of famously failed during Hurricane Katrina, and previous to that, during Hurricane Betsy in the 60s, it's a place where people, especially in marginalized neighborhoods and communities, are always very angry at the Army Corps of Engineers. And this is in part for exactly the reasons you would imagine. There is a hierarchy of place apparent within how the Army Corps of Engineer works. So oftentimes they build the most expensive and elaborate protections around communities where there's a lot of there's a great economic engine. And this is not necessarily true for like a demographic, of course, you might think that might be in large cities, but oftentimes it's really around shipping industries. So where is there a real economic powerhouse around shipping? So sometimes the protection is not necessarily for the people, but just the economies at hand there. So I think part of the conversation around the Army Corps of Engineers is also sort of coming to recognize that oftentimes those who have sort of this perhaps a engineering or like great scientific training have this sort of how do I want to say this? I think that there's a tension between knowledge practices and what knowledges are valued. So a lot of these indigenous communities on the coast or communities of color who have been living and surviving rising coasts and hurricanes and constantly changing landscape really understand how to navigate those things, yet are shut out of any sort of practice or say or agency when it comes to the federal choices being made by the Army Corps of Engineers. So it's a really fraught relationship, of course. I also want to say that I'm very critical of them, but also that their function is to protect many humans. So it's a complicated relationship, of course. Happy to talk any more if I didn't answer any part of that question. Thank you, George.
Ismena, could you switch on your mic?
Oh, yeah. It's been a while for me. Anyway, so Sarah is asking a question. She wrote, "Apologies, my mic is not working. Thank you for your amazing lecture. I wanted to ask the following. In your research on the Isle de Jean Charles community, you've highlighted the challenges faced by its indigenous community. How does this absence of federal recognition exacerbate their vulnerability to climate change, and in what ways has it influenced the dynamics of their resettlement efforts?"
Yeah, this is another great question. So within the United States, there's a really complex and very racist history around which tribes are federally recognized versus what tribes might be perhaps recognized by the state or not even either. So oftentimes in order to get federal recognition, you have to do a lot of genealogical practices. Oftentimes the applications, which began sort of in the 1830s, like require hundreds of pages and legal documentation of the passing of heredity, and showing cultural existence, and that there's something culturally unique that makes them a tribe, and a number of other qualifications. Of course, a huge part of this is in Louisiana because it was certainly indigenous communities, but also Black communities and Cajun communities who fled settler colonization into the coast, into the wetlands, in order to like build their own communities outside. Bloodlines are, of course, very hybrid and mixed, and a representation of the ways that violence expressed itself on a multitude of peoples. So part of the reason Ile de Jean Charles has not been federally recognized, even though that is an interesting tension with the fact that they are one of the few groups that also have received federal funding to relocate, along with another indigenous group on the coast of Alaska. It's interesting that also like the very first two test cases of federal relocation, which of course was in 2016, almost 10 years ago, and certainly wouldn't happen now from the federal government. It's interesting that they were both indigenous communities, and for me speaks to perhaps like a little bit of a test case mentality. It's sort of, again, like a way of reiterating a federal support of land displacement on these two particular indigenous communities. That even though it was a really big deal to get this federal grant to help relocate, and the relocation was incredibly fraught and complicated and difficult, I also feel like at the heart of it is always sort of these underlying settler colonial powers that I'm trying to point to in how we talk about the environment there.
I do have a question. It's not a question, maybe it's also a comment. So while you were talking about settler rhetoric, it really reminded me of the term of climate reductionism, which is like, I think it's a bit similar, where we attribute everything to climate change, while we also overlook other kind of social, political, and structural issues. And this happened, I think, with Hurricane Katrina, where also the communities affected were also labeled as climate refugees and migrants. And we see here it's really by labeling them as migrants, and as by also describing their displacement as caused uniquely by climate change. It's like there is this also power of kind of shaping this narrative, which is really a mainstream narrative here. It's like it totally kind of disregards and overlooks the other structural and institutional failures. And like in the case of Hurricane Katrina, we know that it wasn't really just a natural disaster; it was a man-made one too. And so I really see the similarities here, and I feel like really language like it's very important in how we talk about also. Climate-related language is so important also in kind of establishing these mainstream discourses and narratives.
Absolutely, so, yeah. No, Yasmina, your comment made me think about a text I recently was teaching, Malcolm Ferdinand's Decolonial Ecologies. He's a French philosopher from Martinique, and his whole book is around this idea of the double fracture. So this idea that the fracture of modernity is the fracturing climate from the sort of like the idea that the environmental movement was separated from the movement for social justice. And so his argument is, and I think also my argument is, with this idea of settler rhetorics, which of course is other people's ideas. I'm just building off amazing other academics like Mark Rifkin. That I think the point is, like, we can't actually have a helpful conversation around climate if it's not fundamentally also based in climate justice. You know, we're not answering the roots and the foundations of what the climate crisis actually is if we're not also talking about the way it's inherently entwined and rooted in racial capitalism and indigenous land dispossession, and how that continues today, and continues by people who are probably in agreement with this idea. I think a lot of these environmental writers that I'm looking at also would really agree with these ideas, but it's really hard to disentangle your own language and rhetoric from what you've learned and inherited from the past. We're really trying to, I think that's the project of this book, that I'm trying to have a lot of consciousness around the inherited ideas in language that sort of like unwittingly support this sort of settler colonial mentality.
Yeah, and I have something to ask you about this. Like, when you talk about these environmental writers, you just say that they kind of reproduce and perpetuate this settler rhetoric unintentionally or with the best intentions. So, what really makes you say that? How do you see it, like, really innocent in that sense? I mean, like, it could also reveal a kind of internalized, like, position of power or centrality, from which they come as like white writers here. So, how do you really like this why do you
I mean, I think partially the reason I do this project is because I am a white person in this place. My family, they're Irish migrants. We are settlers in the United States. And I think that it's really easy, especially for those of us who are thoughtful around culture and environment. It's really easy to use languages and ideas that have come before us, right? Like, this is what we're taught and educated through the university to use. I think like Elizabeth Colbert is a great example of this. I think she is a really thoughtful writer. I think maybe I'll say this. I think she's a writer that has a lot of power. She writes for the New Yorker. The Sixth Extinction was like a really big bestseller. I think she's somebody who really prioritizes how we as a culture think about climate. And I'm sure she would also be very for the idea of climate rooted in justice. Yet, I think throughout the entire chapter of Ile de Jean Charles, as I read it, I was like, oh no. There's just, I think it's again going back to that Tim Choi idea, the ecologies of comparison. It's just we have to be really ready to critique our positions of power and the legacies of our knowledge practices, especially those of us within the academy, to be really aware of these pitfalls that we might not even know we're falling into necessarily.
Yes.
I was also wondering whether your scholarship engages with, or one dimension of your scholarship is the various discourses about energy transitions. This is a certain kind of parlance that I think comes from, maybe coming from economic history. I'm not sure. I just have a colleague who's actually really very good sort of historian and contemporary. And so that would be from the then fossil fuels, and then now the recent struggle. This is kind of, it's a struggle because of drill baby drill, towards renewables. I don't know if you even think that it's a constructive way to think about this as discourses of energy transitions, or if you are intervening in those.
Thank you for that question, George. I don't terribly, even though, I mean, I do think about energy quite a bit within my research, of course, because, I am thinking about a place that's deeply impacted and like is one of the engines of the oil and gas economy in the United States. I think of Stacey Balkin, who's at University of Florida, and she is a really great literary scholar who thinks a lot about energy transitions and mostly thinking about like solar energies and how we can, what representations of solar energies might do to help us and help students think about energy transitions. Weirdly, in my work right now at the Climate Museum is maybe where I'm dealing with that more. Recently, they just did an exhibition called The End of Fossil Fuels, which thought about what is the reason that we arrived to this place in which climate change is so so rampant. Like, how did we get here? And of course, that's like very much rooted in coloniality. And then they think about like, how do we get out? And so they think like part of the exhibition included a lot of research, or sort of like creating a public visual way of engaging with research that shows that fossil fuel companies have long known about climate change and had strategies to sort of disengage the public or, convince the public it was their own fault. Like the creation of the carbon footprint was actually a marketing ploy from Exxon because they wanted humans to feel like, oh, well, if I just drove less or if I just, walked more, then maybe that would be what I need to do rather than addressing the systemic issue at hand. So yeah, I think oddly more with the museum and sort of like engaging in a public humanities discourse of like, what does it actually mean to consider like the end of fossil fuels? That seems to be where I'm thinking about it right now. But I do feel like there's so much more, and I imagine it will continue in my work throughout the future. But I'd be interested to hear about the historian that you mentioned you said was doing good work around this.
Yeah, his name is Ewan Gibbs. I'll drop his name into the chat.
Yeah.
I think he earned his PhD at the University of, I want to say, Glasgow, economic history, and he is now at the University of Glasgow as well as lecturer, and he's been doing some great work, including sort of what you call it, outreach or public history programming. So do look him up. He's great, and he's got plenty to say.
Yes. I mean, the whole field of energy humanities is just like blowing up, and rightfully so. So that's great. Thank you for sharing that. Yasmina, I think you're muted still.
Yes. So we do have one more question in the chat box by Hind. So she says, settler moves to innocence, and this is quoted, I think, according to Tak and Young, right? So this is the question for you. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I'm sorry. Let me look at the chat. Yeah, I love. Yes, exactly. That quote that I included from them in the presentation is from that exact article. That's part of the settler moves to innocence. So exactly.
Yeah. Right. I don't know if we have more questions. Yeah, George is raising his hand.
Yes, sorry, just one more, and you can you can very easily basically say if this is not relevant if you're not engaging with that body of scholarship, because I'm understanding that American studies is not what it used to be, and it's basically there's all us Americanists are coming at our topics from so many different fields and subfields and studies and all that. So classic American studies. I wonder, do you engage with any, there's like the scholars of classic American studies? This is really has really, really long beards. Leo Marx is the machine in the garden, or more 1980s is Patricia Limerick and William Cronin and some of these folks. In between is Alan Trachtenberg's studies like myth and symbol stuff of the Brooklyn Bridge. So do you engage with them? I'm trying to sort of not push you to sort of talk about things that you and I wonder if you think that it's basically, as with public discourse, our scholarly discourse in American studies was for a long time very much settler colonial. I mean, these
Yeah.
are the people who are writing this. But I
Yeah.
wonder if you decided to engage with that could potentially open you to additional audiences. So some of the sort of the older people in the field might
Yeah.
be wanting to listen to you more because you're talking about stuff that they, when the world stopped with them, that was still there.
Yeah. Oh, that's a hard question to answer. I mean, I certainly have read many of these, William Cronin for sure. But I also think it's just because I kind of came, I don't know if even though of course I think largely about the Gulf, I don't even know if I would call myself necessarily like a American studies scholar. I think of myself as like an environmental humanities person. I think of myself as a literary scholar. I think a lot about the Gulf as like a transnational space. I think the reason I like to think about the Gulf is because some of my other chapters deal with it in a more transnational way, thinking about Mexico and its oil industries, the Caribbean, and um, you know, I think it's a really good comment because I'm sure you're correct. And maybe something, maybe something I should. I almost feel like I don't even know how to do that.
No, can we have no? Can we have the next webinar? Forget the classic American stuff. Can we have the next webinar? You talking about the transnational dimensions? I think that would be absolutely amazing. I think that
Yeah.
would be really, really interesting.
Well, maybe just two books I'll plug that I love a lot before we go is Archipelagic American Studies, which I think is sort of a little bit what I'm doing, right, in a different way. Like, how is the U.S., really fundamentally different than how it's been conceptualized previously. And then also another book I love is How to Hide an Empire, which is about how the United States sort of became this imperial power without really seeming to be an imperial power. I feel like those, and weirdly, I was trained in post-colonial studies, which is not even necessarily thinking about the United States. So I think it's just that I have this background that's not a traditional US studies background that makes it a little bit weird, but I like that. And I think it gives me a better perspective, especially in this current moment in time. Oh, what good comments.
Yasmina, your mic.
Yes, I'm so sorry. So we have a couple of comments, I think, here in the chat box from Ginny Tini. I hope I'm well pronouncing your name. So, a most timely, welcome, necessary, and refreshing presentation. Is it being archived so we can share it with others to view afterwards? Yeah, we've recorded the talk and it will be available in our YouTube channel very soon. I don't know when exactly, but maybe Ishtiaq could tell us when.
Yeah. I know I said that please feel free to record and share. So I believe that's happening.
It should be uploaded by tonight or tomorrow. Maybe.
Cool. So you could just find it in our YouTube channel. Maybe
I'll just send the link here.
Yes, the link. Yeah, please, Ishtiaq. So we have Emilio. He's in the area where I'm from, in central Italy. The far right is appropriating environmentally conscious language to direct local activists against aeolian energy. Aeolian companies do expropriate lands and consume oil, I think, or soil. But this situation is slowing the conversation on energetic transition and favoring colonialist oil companies like Eni, who have spent a lot in reframing themselves in the public mind as a green company. Does language work as a weapon both ways?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes. Again, like I would emphasize it's worth reading this book, Ecologies of Comparison, which is by Tim Choi and is around sort of the conflicts between environmental groups and indigenous communities in Hong Kong. And I feel like he does a really good job of like going through the ways in which yeah, I think he just goes through, does a really good job about like really considering knowledge practices, but also like maybe more to your point here. I really do think language can absolutely work as a weapon in both ways. And I think maybe what I was just talking about with Exxon using the carbon footprint calculator is maybe a good example of this. This is an oil and gas company using environmental language, right? Like, how do we calculate our carbon footprint so that we can be environmentally conscious? I think we tend to think of it, the environmental language and literature as being very sort of on the left and, trying to find ways to be just. But I think part of maybe my project is that we should always be suspicious of environmental language because environmental language, like its inheritance is coloniality. So I think it absolutely works in all ways as a weapon, which is why we should always be so careful with narratives. Thank you for that question. Such a good one.
Yeah. Do we have any more questions? I don't think so. I just have one last question, perhaps, and you could just maybe just give a brief answer if you have, of course. So I was thinking about this, always this settler rhetoric, which is like, how do you really see it evolving or within the current American political climate? Because it's really, it's a favorable, I think, climate for settler rhetoric. And especially like we have a climate denialist from on the one hand, and who's also leading a very like openly like a colonial project. He wants to buy everything. He wants to like to relocate people. And so, how do you really see this rhetoric evolving and being also endorsed within this really? Yeah, political climate and discourse like in the US today. Yeah.
Well, I think I don't know, I maybe have a couple quick answers to that, which is just that like I actually think that like I use this term as a critique, and I think the current administration is using it as something positive. Like, I mean, it's a weapon to them, and they're using that in a positive way. I also would say maybe that's again the problem of rhetoric and communication right now. I think oftentimes when I say one thing, I think my intent is to show the critique behind it, and I think other people see it and read quite the opposite at times. That's sort of the unfortunate place that we're in the United States right now. I also would just add that really like one of the core foundation texts of the project is, of course, Edward Said's Orientalism. So I think a lot of my settler rhetorics are 100% sort of a rethinking Orientalism from the perspective of indigenous communities on a coastline that's deeply threatened. They're really oftentimes very similar, like tropes and stereotypes found. But I think, Said is, of course, always like our, lodestar for looking through, like, where are the cracks in narratives that show us power.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the discussion. Yet one of the center of resistance to the new havoc in the federal government is the Alternative National Park Service. So maybe you know something about this. I don't really know this, but
It's I don't know much either. I've just seen it's a weird time. It's a weird time in the world.
yeah. All right. So we're 5 minutes past the hour. So we were so really happy, and we really enjoyed your talk, and we learned so much from it. So thank you so much for being our guest. And, yeah. So we hope to
Thank
see you
you.
also maybe in another webinar. So thank you so much. Thank you for everyone for joining us. And please, you could visit our website, the IASA website, to learn more about like future events or future webinars. Or if you want to also become a member of the association, also please check our website. We will have the World Congress, the 12th, I think, World Congress soon in May 2024, and some of us, I think, will be there. So this is one of the events we're having soon. And yeah, so it was really nice having you all, and thank you for
Thank you,
joining.
Yasmina, and thank you everybody for listening. Thank you.
Thank you.